So we're going to start at Space for Everyone?
What do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, but I mean, what I'm planning on doing now, it's going to be all the way over there too. So before we get on to the radio, we are on TV. Well, not TV, the other type of TV.
It's television. It's not broadcast television.
Well, people can
YouTube.
watch it on YouTube.
Yeah, right. I hope this
that's
works. I'd be like, I never trust other gear except for my own, and they were like, start using this microphone. I'm like, I'll try it. We'll see.
All right.
I used it one other time, and it seemed fine. Some kitchen table astronomy here in Amherst with Hampshire College astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe. You were just part of a conference that begged the question, is space for everybody?
Yes, so I was at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, AAAS, and it was in DC. I thought it would be much warmer, but it wasn't.
Oh.
Initially it was, but there was some gale storm and all of that stuff. The last day was beautiful. So this is the organization, as the name says, sort of like, it's about the promotion of science, advancement of science. But this one the theme was science for society. Mm-hmm. And I was there in particular to attend some sessions which dealt with ethics of space. So the ones I attended 2 sessions regarding that. One was about Artemis diplomacy. So Artemis is the program for the moon that the NASA is sort of
Artemis,
leading.
the twin sister of Apollo, an all-female mission to the moon that's being planned.
Right, and the session on Artemis diplomacy was very official.
Yeah.
So meaning to say there was no real ethics part. It was like, well, we have set things like, right and so forth. Like, we are trying our best, like, that as long as everybody plays by the rules, I think we'll be good. But of course, these were diplomats. These were sort of like, more official, and so you don't get as much out of those kind of sessions as an academic, right? It's like, where's the spicy stuff? Like, But the other session that I went to was organized by a subdivision within the AAAS called DOSER. This is the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. And I've been part of sort of like, their one of their programs so I was on their board for that. And it's a really fascinating one. Oftentimes they deal with science and religion, but also ethics is also part of that. So they organized a session which was called Is Space for Everyone? And it had interesting scholars in there. One was, he's a native, from Canada, indigenous astronomer. And he talked about, his name is Hilding Nielsen, and he talked about that why it is so important to bring multiple perspectives, including indigenous perspectives, when we talk about exploring the moon, settling the moon, and so on and so forth, because oftentimes it's about extraction of resources.
Yeah.
And what his point was that, well, but not everybody thinks like that. I mean, some people believe that land, for example, especially for many indigenous religions in North America, that land is crucial, that you take care of the land. And if you use it, what are you giving back to the land? And that was actually really interesting way he was, he brought that up. And because there was one question, okay, so what would be the indigenous component of that? What would be indigenous astronomy or indigenous way of thinking would be like? And that's what he said, that you cannot own that land in particular, but rather you have a relationship with it. And I mean, these are tough questions. I mean, I'm not saying that this is easy, but these are tough questions, and he brought it up. The other really interesting one was by Alyssa Hadaji, who is, I think she is a space lawyer. And
whoa.
Yeah, she has a degree in space law. And I think she's getting another PhD, I think in sociology or anthropology or something like that. And she runs Space Consortium at Harvard and MIT. And she brought up the issue of planetary defense and defense from asteroid threat, for example. And it gets messy very quickly, because some of the ways we talk about deflecting asteroids is by using nukes, for example.
Mm-hmm. We just did an experiment, the NASA, to push an asteroid off course to see if we could do that. They just got some of the data back about how much material was lost from that sending a spacecraft to crash into an asteroid. It was essentially a successful mission, right?
Right, but that was a kinetic one, meaning to say you just slam into an asteroid, right? But there are other ideas about having, for example, a nuclear explosion sort of like near the asteroid to deflect it.
To push it away.
The problem is that Outer Space Treaty, which everybody has signed, one of the things is that you cannot use those kind of weapons of mass destruction, for example, in space. And so would you violate that, right, treaty in order to what? What would be the state when you go like, you know what, screw the treaty, I'm going to explode it, right?
Yeah.
So she runs these programs where they actually bring in people from various space agencies as well and give them different scenarios, because they're creating a framework in terms of thinking about what if there is a real threat, how would we react to that? So this is one of the questions, right? I mean, like, okay, so this is a violation of an international treaty that you are a signatory to. Are you going to do that? People will be like, I mean, like, one may think, of course, it's to save humanity. Yeah, but how sure are we that this is going to hit? What would be the damage? So on and so forth. So it actually gets messy pretty quickly.
It's not unlike the movie from last year, Don't Look Up, where the international community had to make these decisions, and they made many of them poorly.
That's right. And she talks about, what I thought was fascinating was she talked about, for example, issues of displacement, that usually when there are crises here, you have people go from one country to another, and usually those are neighboring countries. But if you have an asteroid coming in and say, for example, it's not destroying, if it's destroying the entire humanity, well, that's a different scenario, but more likely than not, there can be a size where some parts of the world are going to get destroyed. Well, you cannot just go to the neighboring country. Then the displacement has to be massive. And you can imagine, even if small migrations these days can cause a havoc, what would happen when you have mass scale and much farther off?
Just if you're tuning in, this isn't happening right now. This is all worst case scenario planning from a conference that Hampshire College astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed just went to.
But this is not the War of the Worlds.
Yeah, no, so if you're just tuning in the middle of it, this is not an imminent threat right now.
But just to sort of like, close it this loop, because she said that they are doing this interesting scenario this year. And she said that normally they don't announce it ahead of time, but this time they have, so people can prepare, these space agency people. And the scenario is such that where you have this asteroid coming in and there is a chance it would hit North America or somewhere in Africa. And so the question is, we don't know yet. So the people are preparing for it. And then it becomes clear that it's going to hit Africa.
That's your dog, Wookie.
Oh, that's right. That's Wookie. So, what would you do then?
Right.
I mean, what kind of resources you do? So that's, again, that brings up class. That brings up sort of like other kinds of issues in terms of privileged countries versus unprivileged, or like, and so on and so forth. So very interesting conversations, very rich conversations, and it is good to know that people are thinking about these things.
Another thing that came up, I believe, at the same conference is our favorite topic, aliens. This also came up with Colbert on his late night show, talking with Steven Spielberg recently about, with all the UAPs, UFOs, Chinese balloons, again, still, people are buzzing about space aliens.
Right, so I should clarify, because if we say the way, that it came up, aliens came up at the AAAS meeting.
And AAAS stands for, again, one?
American Association for the Advancement of Sciences.
Got it.
And I may never get invited again.
Right.
Okay. Not because they are censoring me, but because there is no evidence for that other than, we've talked about it quite a bit.
Right.
So, and that is precisely what I wanted to talk to you about this, because, for example, there was one session was about how to report on evidence for life beyond Earth. So there is this session at the AAAS conference where you had one astrobiologist, one journal editor, and one science writer for the Washington Post. So, and there was a sober conversation about, so how hard it is, how difficult it is to figure out, really, that we have found a microbe which is extraterrestrial, for example, not from here. How do we figure? And they used examples, for example, a famous one, ALH 84001, that was the Martian meteoroid from Mars that was discovered on Earth, and in the mid-90s, people thought, in fact, there was a big press conference by NASA in which they thought they had evidence for ancient life from Mars.
Microbial life.
Microbial
not intelligent life necessarily, not little green men.
And it was a hotly debated issue, and now pretty much most, not everybody, but most scientists believe that it probably was not, that what it was contamination, or those were not life forms. And so this is an interesting case that it was announced that it probably is, right? Life. And then there were other cases. More recently, there was the case of potential detection of phosphine on the planet Venus, in the atmosphere of Venus, and that may have sort of like signified maybe there is life, and so on and so forth. So there were a couple of examples that people used, but they talked about how difficult it is, right? And they thought about, and in fact, one of the astrobiologist, Heather Graham, she talked about that they have a biosignature assessment framework, and there was a full conference on that, like how would we determine that, how sure do we have to be, and how do we determine, yes, this is a biosignature of sort of like a microbe from extraterrestrial, or from outside the Earth, and then how do we disseminate that information, and so on and so forth. And to me, what was striking was that the disconnect between like Spielberg and others, oh yeah, there's UAPs out, and of course, well, it's really interesting, like,
Yeah, they're probably hiding something. And they're getting ready to tell us something that we're not ready to hear yet.
And they are jumping to like Spielberg speculating on, like, maybe it's humans from far future coming back and looking at, I mean, why? I mean, where are we? I mean, like, forget about, like, that thinking about, are those UAPs kind of like, alien spacecraft? That's a huge, gigantic claim. And I know we talked about it last week too, but I just want to say this is the reason, that, like this, where there is a whole framework for how sure can we be even when there is a microbe, and it's a very hard problem, and people grapple with that to, I don't understand what this is. It's moving in a different way. And jumping to the conclusion that this is a spacecraft, not just life, an intelligent civilization that has managed to travel sort of like millions or thousands of light years and have come here, and they are hanging out and, just messing with our palates. So this is sort of like, I thought that was very interesting between that contrast. And in fact, one thing I brought up, I asked this question, like, that I consider that as a success story, that despite these claims that make a lot of media hype regarding ALH 84001, the Martian meteoroid, or Venus, life on the atmosphere of Venus, or there was a claim for life in the arsenic, and so on and so forth. It gets a lot of headlines, but then it peters out. So I was like, isn't that a success story that actually, if you ask people, do we have evidence for of alien microbes, probably people are going to say no.
Well, scientific people are going to say no. I think you ask your general person on the street, they'll probably have seen one of these headlines and say, yeah, didn't we find life somewhere else?
I don't know. I'm not 100% sure. I think...
Don't be one of those, listener.
I think there are two different boxes the way people think. One is, okay, what do we know in terms of microbes and things like that? And yeah, that's what my guess. Again, we need data for that on what people think. But I think there is a separate way of thinking, separate box that comes in when it comes to UFOs. Like, suddenly it's like the switch is in a different way. But what they were saying, and I think that the most salient point they made was, it's not that it's a binary thing. Oh, we didn't get life. That's it. It's not interesting. Mm-hmm. No. Actually, finding all of these things, the fact that we are debating those questions so close, actually, it gives a lot of information, and it's fascinating. So, for example, ALH 84001, the Martian meteoroid, it gave us a lot of information, including, there are organic compounds there, and there is all of this other studies of there. Sure, ultimately, it wasn't evidence that there was life, but there was a lot of other stuff. So, these are really interesting, informative results, except that in none of these cases there has been life. And that is a good reminder that when you have these kind of announcements, right, in science, that is the beginning of inquiry. not the end. We found life and now we can just sit back. And same thing with even with UAPs. Like, first of all, we haven't even even if they were real. And listeners, if is a big thing. That may simply be the beginning of thinking about it, let alone speculating on, they may be humans coming back, or they have this intention, that intention. We cannot say anything because we don't know.
Hampshire College astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe. Oh, you have more to say on this?
Yeah, there is one more session that happened over there, and that was on, again, in a similar way, it was about origins of life and detecting biosignatures around other planets. And that was a fascinating session. One of the speakers over there was Didier Queloz, who got actually the Nobel Prize for detecting the first exoplanet around a sun-like star. And he talked about sort of like, that how we are looking for, now we have 5,000 confirmed detections of exoplanets, and how people are looking for, the James Webb Space Telescope, for example, the atmospheres. And those atmospheres, can they tell us whether there is biology there or not? And there was another person, Emily Mitchell. She was a chemist, I think chemist or biologist, and she talked about how our Earth's atmosphere has changed over the past 4.5 billion years because of life. Right, because oxygen was not there. Oxygen actually came from the presence of oxygen in the atmosphere is the result of the blue-green algae that sort of that was under the oceans, and that released a lot of oxygen. So what we breathe, we think that's essential. Well, that was produced by plants. So the original, the early life forms, for them actually oxygen would have been poisonous. So our atmosphere was changed because of life, and that is the reason we can look for biosignatures in the atmospheres of exoplanets, because if we find exoplanets whose atmospheres look to have those components that life can change, then we can actually think about maybe that's what's going on. But to me, the interesting part of her talk was, she said, we don't know what path evolution takes, how long these things take. So on Earth, for 3 billion years, they were just microbes before complex life started, right? In other places, that may not be the case. So when do these changes happen? We don't know, because we only have one example. But she said why she is excited about these exoplanets is because it gives biologists a phenomenal laboratory to study. So imagine, you have a few thousand of these atmospheres. If we get to that point, it's going to take some time, but then you can say, oh, wait a minute, look, in some planets, the atmosphere may have changed this way. In some planets, it may have changed the other way. So that was really interesting. And one of the highlights for me, this is completely irrelevant from this conversation, but of course, when there were questions, there was a big line that people were there for questions, and one young guy came in. I don't know. Again, I don't know how young he was, but anyway, he looked pretty young, and he had a phone in his hand, and he goes. And remember, this is AAAS. There's a Nobel laureate sitting up there, who discovered the first exoplanet around the sun.
Meaning a planet outside of our solar system.
Planet outside of our solar system, and this kid goes to the microphone and he goes he takes out his phone and he says, well, you were introduced as that you were the first person who detected the planet outside our solar system, but I just checked. Actually, that was actually somebody else. And I'm just wondering, how was that claim? Why did you get associated with the first exoplanet? That's a really interesting point, because that's true. And the speaker actually did here, Queloz actually, he said, you are absolutely right, because the first detection of planets around another body was actually around a pulsar or a neutron star, around a dead star. And that's indeed true. And that was before, I think a year before, a few months before this discovery. But those were not really considered planets, because there the Death Star is the result of a supernova, and we think that planets form from the debris from the exploding star, and so on and so forth. But I was like, wow. I mean,
You can fact check in real time.
well, not just that. And then you walk up to the microphone, full of scientists, and you go like, you get a Nobel Prize, but excuse me, you have that. So I thought that was my favorite moment of the conference.
Hampshire College astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe. One of your other roles is on the board of Amherst Cinema. The Oscars is this coming weekend. You have any favorites that you're rooting for?
Oh man, that's and Monty, you and I are going to. I think we may get into a fighting match if I say it what I really want to say.
Go ahead, because I will kung fu fight you.
Yeah, there you go. I think I loved Tar. I thought that was. In terms of thinking about a movie that's sort of like grand scale, it's a great, rich story.
That's the Kate Blanchett conductor one.
That's exactly right. So I absolutely loved it, and I think that's really good. And which one are you favoring, Monty?
Everything Everywhere All at Once. It is my favorite movie in a long time. I've watched it 3 times. I love Everything Everywhere All at Once about it. It's so good. It's already cleaned up the other award ceremonies, and you didn't love it.
Okay.
Khalees is also gonna kung fu fight you when she hears this.
No, I thought I loved I loved the first half, and then I was just like, okay, now they're just throwing everything but the kitchen sink, and no, actually including the kitchen sink, and it just became just random. And okay, I don't want to, because I know a lot of people love it, and I'm not going to spoil it, but it's fine.
Cool.